Hello and welcome to this special edition video that looks at the role of drawings and schematics in construction procurement. I'm just going to take you through some specific construction language and then construction procurement language and the documents that we would use in a tender. So in terms of construction terminology from a structure perspective, you might hear the terms substructure or superstructure. These are essential components to a building. So the superstructure is the visible part of the building that sits above the ground. It starts from the ground floor to the top of the building. Your substructure is the portion below the soil, and that's what we sometimes refer to as the foundations. When we're looking at construction projects, there are a number of things that we would look at. So first is a feasibility study. They're preliminary investigations that are undertaken at very early stages of a project to assess whether or not the project is viable. They tend to be carried out by external consultants, and they're carried out when a project is relatively large or complex, or where there's a little bit of doubt or controversy regarding that proposed development. The GIA is the gross internal area, and that is the area of the building that's measured to the internal face of the perimeter wall at each floor level. The preliminary design is a phase where further developed plans show the physical space and the attributes. So you've got things like doors and windows and walls. The schematic design phase, or the SD, is a conceptual plan which shows the location of program space at a much more detailed and scaled size. The building envelope is sometimes referred to as the shell, and it's the waterproof elements of a building which enclose conditioned spaces through which thermal energy may be transferred to or from the exterior, and the outer structure of the building. So the thing with construction is that delivery isn't the same as products and services. There's a huge amount of work that happens until we get to a position called practical completion. So generally, this is the point at which the building project is complete, except for minor defects that can be put right without any undue interference or disturbance to the occupier. Time and materials, T&M, is a written agreement between the owner and the contractor, where the payment is based on the contractor's actual cost for labour, equipment, materials and services, plus a fixed add-on to cover for the contractor's overheads and profit. Quite a common term we hear in construction is value engineering, or VE. So this happens when we want to evaluate the construction methods and or the materials to determine whether or not the net result could be better by reducing the cost, but keeping the performance, reliability, etc. the same. So it is about making sure you've got consistency with specific performance, reliability, maintainability, aesthetics, safety and security criteria. BIM is building information modelling. This is a process involving the generation and management of digital representations of physical and functional characteristics of places. And MEP is mechanical, electrical and plumbing. They're generally a set of drawings as part of the standard drawings within the construction set of blueprints, but you'll know exactly where every pipe is and electrical cable, etc., etc. And that can actually be shown in the BIM model as well. Elevation is shown in a set of architectural drawings. It's a view from the front and sides of the house or a building. And depending on who you are appointing to do the construction, you may look for a parent company guarantee, which is a guarantee given by one contracting party's ultimate or immediate holding company in favour of the other contracting party to secure the performance of that party's obligations under the contract. And it's quite common to look for a performance bond as well, which is a financial guarantee to one party in the contract against the failure of the other party to meet its obligations. It's also referred to as a contract bond. But this performance bond is usually provided by a bank or an insurance company to make sure contractors comply and complete the designated projects, and they're usually somewhere between 10 and 20% of the contract value. And a vesting certificate or agreement for construction goods, plants and materials in letter form is used to confirm that the ownership of the goods, plants and materials will transfer from one party to another. Very important when you've got equipment that it's being made specifically for your building. So if you took some, I don't know, boilers or heat pumps or something that the contractor had purchased on your behalf, but you've paid for, if anything happened to the contractor in between placing the order for the equipment and actually delivery, the vesting certificate would prove that it belonged to you rather than the contractor. So let's look at some procurement type language now. So we don't tend to use the word supplier in construction. In fact, we replace that with the word contractor. A contractor is a company that's licensed to perform certain types of construction activities. In most, it kind of states the general contractor's licenses, and some speciality contractor licenses don't require compliance with things like bonds, workman compensation, and similar regulations. So some of the speciality contractor licenses will involve intensive training, testing, and insurance. So the various types of contractors, you can start with a general contractor or a principal contractor. They tend to be responsible for the execution and supervision and coordination of lots of different individual tasks that sit underneath it. And most general contractors are not licensed to perform all the speciality trades like gas safety or asbestos removal or something along those lines. A remodeling contractor is a general contractor who specialises in remodeling, so they change the layouts, walls, interiors, that sort of thing. And a speciality contractor is the type that the general couldn't potentially do. So they're licensed to perform specific tasks. It could be electrical, it could be side sewers, it could be asbestos. And a subcontractor it generally sits underneath the main contractor as either a general subcontractor or a speciality subcontractor. Like scaffolding would be an example of a subcontractor. So moving on to the next one, the employer. The employer is just a different way of calling you a buyer. So we don't tend to say buyer, supplier, we say contractor and employer. So the employer is your organisation, you're employing the contractor to do work for you. And design and build is responsible for designing the dwellings, but also building it. So we see that quite a lot in construction. Now, in terms of the tender documents, when we go out to tender, there's a hell of a lot more drawings and schedules and things like that we would probably put into it, more than a typical kind of, tender. But you still need an invitation to tender. You still need to specify what your requirements are, when you need it, why you need it, how they should respond. And then you have an employer's requirement. So remember what I said earlier about the fact that we don't refer to us as a buyer, we refer to ourselves as an employer. So the employer's requirement is your specification, essentially. This is what we are requiring you to do for us. And it describes the products, the materials, the works, as well as a description of the project. It's got key dates, the location, the extent, and any other project arrangements. Preliminaries, or prelims as they're sometimes shortened to, will include pre-construction information. It will have things like site waste management plan and a description of the project that allows the contractor to assess the costs, which, whilst they don't necessarily form part of any of the works. So they tend to be things like, I don't know, welfare facilities and things like that. So that they wouldn't get left behind with the building, so it doesn't make up the bricks and the mortar. Other things you might include in there are things like planning and managing construction work, any communication and liaisons, security, site holdings, transport to and from site for their workers, permits to work, fire precautions, emergency procedures, a means of escape, parking, smoking, confined spaces. There's things like what they can do in terms of waste collections and deliveries and storage. They might even want to talk about what's on the adjacent land. Is it like a school or something which potentially might have sensitive receptors, like young children, or noise pollution, the ground conditions, plant equipment, health and safety. There's quite a lot in there. You've also got a tender pricing document or a contract sum analysis, a CSA. So the CSA will essentially have it will set out the way in which we want the contractor to price the job, and that will include a breakdown of all of the individual costs, and it will specify whether it's going to be a fixed cost or a cost plus or a target cost or whatever the cost might be. It needs to be captured in that CSA, that contract sum analysis. And that helps us to kind of enable a like-for-like comparison between the tenders. And it will also enable the kind of cost consultant to assess whether or not value lies within different tenders, like the foundations or the finishes or something like that. This is a good document to identify problems or differences, maybe something that's been incorrectly interpreted. It might identify areas where you might be able to get a saving, but ultimately it forms the financial basis of the contract. Your form of contract, sorry, I skipped over that one. In most cases, construction would form a model form contract. So you've got JCT, which is the Joint Contracting Tribunal, or an NEC contract, which is the New Engineering Contract. If this was a demolition contract, you might use the NFDC, which is the National Federation for Demolition Contractors. So that is a model form contract that's been pre-populated by industry experts, but it will be complemented by a schedule of amendments. So this is the bits where there were blanks and you have to pick the blanks or the options, plus any other bits and pieces that you want to include. And then under the specifications, you might see drawings and copies of things like the feasibility study or the options appraisal. There could be concept drawings that have been sketched. You know, some designers will differentiate between a conceptual design and a schematic design. But the concept is the initial design idea, which, you know, where the scheme develops from. Whereas when we get into the schematic design, it's more functional and practical. So those detailed drawings can be technical, shop drawings, installation drawings, but they need to form part of the contract and part of the tender. If you are using BIM, there'll be a BIM protocol, so employer information that's required for BIM, so that can then be developed as part of the project throughout the build and for the resulting operation of that completed asset. And then you've got R&D surveys which relate to asbestos. So it will cover things like asbestos, contaminated land, hazardous materials, storage, or it could be an ecological survey. So if you've got things like bats or newts or something like that in the local area too. So it sounds like quite a lot of information, but it's necessary, because the problem you get with construction is if you haven't given all of that information up front and the supplier gives you a price, they won't necessarily know about things like bats or newts or asbestos. Whereas with this, they've got that information in advance, which enables them to price it appropriately. You wouldn't want them to price it assuming that none of those things were a problem. And then, you know, a month or so into the construction, they start to ask for extras because they hadn't considered those bits. The drawings that we send out to suppliers can sometimes be really big documents. So much so they're probably too big to email sometimes. We might have to put like a data room, like an electronic data room for access to these sorts of documents. You do sometimes see them with a .dwg at the end, which stands for from a drawing. It's a binary file format used to store 2- and 3-dimensional design data and any metadata. And it's the narrative format for several CADs. CADs is computer-aided drawings. So you've got like DriveSite, AutoCAD, IntelCAD, and CADI. But it's basically supported on many other CAD sort of applications, the .dwg program. Red line is a drawing essentially with a red line that shows corrections or changes to a previous drawing. So it comes from the term where years ago people used to put a red pen and amend the drawings by hand. So these changes and markups can show the changes made to a drawing during the manufacture or construction. And Revit is, again, it's a computer program. It's a Revit Autodesk, a building information or a BIM software for architects, structural engineers, MEP engineers, designers and contractors. And it allows the users to design a building and structure and its components in a three-dimensional model. And it annotates the model with 2D drawing elements and drafting. And it goes into a database. And it is also capable of four-dimensional to track various stages of the building life cycle, including, like I say, things like plumbing and electrics that are all kind of hidden behind the walls. BIM would show you that. So your construction drawings guide the construction process by depicting a structural dimension, installation materials, other factors, and it can also help ensure that local agencies grant the project any necessary permits or permissions. And in most situations, architects create all the construction drawings for the project. So it sort of goes through this this kind of phase where it's got a pre-design, a schematic design, they develop it, they do all the drawings and specs. That then forms part of our construction and procurement, and it ultimately becomes the building occupancy and operation too. And this is just an example of like a floor plan that you might issue out as part of your tender. So you want to show where things need to be located. This is where you can see like the doors and the windows and the lift shafts and where the bathrooms might be. Again, all super important from a clarity perspective. So over the remaining slide, I'm just going to go through the RIBA stages. So RIBA stands for the Royal Institute of British Architects, and it's a very well-known terminology to talk about RIBA stages in terms of where a project is as it moves through these different stages. So when we go to tender, we have a choice about whether we go at RIBA stage 2, where it's just a concept, and a supplier can come and design and build. So they would need to take the concept, fully design it, and then build it. Or we could go out at RIBA stage 4, where we've completely designed it ourselves and we just ask someone to come and build our designs. So there is a difference in terms of how you might appoint contractors. So RIBA stage 0, this is just very early on in terms of a definition. We know that there's an opportunity that we're looking to pursue, and I guess the outcome really is to have a business case at the end of RIBA stage 0. If that business case is approved, we would go to RIBA stage 1, where we prepare and brief. So we look at things like the budget, the surveys. This is where your feasibility will come into play. You just want to make sure that all of that information is correct and it's still worth pursuing. If you get through RIBA 1, you move to RIBA 2. So at the end of RIBA 2, we actually want that outline specification or that high-level brief. So it's a conceptual design. It's not a detailed design. It's purely high-level concept of how it could or would look. At the end of RIBA 3, we'll have a spatial coordination. So cost plans, planning applications, the strategies of an outline specification at that stage about what we're looking to build. And assuming, of course, that planning permission is agreed. And at the end of stage 4, we get to a technical design. So we have a full list now of what needs to be done, sizes, shapes, finishes, everything is completely nailed down at the end of your RIBA stage 4. So it indicates what it's going to look like at the end of RIBA 7. When you're in RIBA 5, you're constructing the building at that particular stage. So you're on site, you're erecting the building, and you need to make sure that you've got your BIM, your health and safety, your asset information, and your practical completion at the end of RIBA stage 5. At that point, you hand the building over. And then you move into RIBA 6, the formal handover, where you get a final certificate and feedback on the project and how well things have gone. You might have a snagging list here where you've got some defects, as I mentioned earlier. They won't necessarily stop you from occupying and using the building, but it might be, fixing a bracket, or one of the taps aren't working or something like that, but it doesn't actually stop you from being in the building. But there's a post-occupancy evaluation at this stage in the handover. And then the final one is RIBA 7. So it's now fully in use. Defects should be rectified at this stage, and you're now operating and maintaining it effectively. And in some contracts, the supplier might be, or sorry, the contractor might be responsible for the operating and maintenance, or just the maintenance, for a period of time after the building has been put in use. It tends to happen on really big stuff like big hospitals or something like that have been built. And that's to ensure that they build it to the best quality, because they would be responsible for maintaining it for the next 5 years. So it isn't in their interests, I suppose, to do it cheap and then just walk away. I think so in some instances, we would hold the supplier, the contractor, sorry, responsible for maintaining the building in stage 7 for a period of time too. Okay, so that's the end of this this particular special video. Hope you found that interesting. Thank you so much for watching.